Welcome to our Sunday School Bible study time here at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This is our lesson for Sunday, June 19th. We are continuing our look at 1 Kings. And this is our third lesson where we look at the life of King Solomon in Israel. Our lesson today is entitled Compromised. Ungodly partnerships lead to spiritual compromise. Today we take a look at chapters 9, 10, and 11 in 1 Kings. We'll focus on chapter 11, the first 13 verses there. Solomon is a really interesting case study. The gifted British expositor Alexander Maclaren said Scripture never blinks the defects of its heroes. Its portraits do not smooth out wrinkles, but with absolute fidelity give all faults. And that kind of honesty is seen in our record of the life of King Solomon. As we've seen in the last 2 weeks, God gave Solomon unusual wisdom and incredible wealth, great opportunities. But as we're going to see in today's lesson, in his older years, he turned away from God. And he made foolish decisions, and his life did not end well. Proverbs 19:3 says, "A man's own folly ruins his life." Solomon wrote those words, and I'm sure he believed them, but he didn't heed them. And that made all the difference. In the 9th chapter of 1 Kings, the first 9 verses there, God makes another appearance to King Solomon. And he says this, "It came about when Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house and all that Solomon desired to do, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your plea, which you've offered before me. I've consecrated this house, which you've built, by putting my name there forever. And my eyes and my heart will be there always. As for you, if you walk before me, as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and honesty, acting in accordance with everything that I've commanded you, and if you keep my statutes and my ordinances, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, just as I promised to your father David, saying, you shall not be deprived of a man on the throne of Israel." That's an important promise that God made to Solomon here in this second appearance. In the rest of chapter 9, it tells about some cities that Solomon gave to Hiram, who had been such a big help in building and providing the materials to do the building that he wanted to do. There's also a further description of the forced labor that the people of Israel endured during Solomon's reign, and that's important down the road in the life of Israel. In chapter 10, the first 13 verses, there's an account of the Queen of Sheba coming to visit Solomon to explore his known wisdom. There, it's a very interesting account. And then the last verses, 14 through 29 in chapter 10, detail Solomon's wealth and splendor and wisdom. Verses 23 through 25 kind of sum that up. So King Solomon became greater than all the kings of the earth in wealth and wisdom. And all the earth was seeking the attention of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. And they were bringing everyone a gift, articles of silver and gold, garments, weapons, balsam, oil, horses, and mules, so much year by year. So the picture we see there is of a king who had everything. God had blessed him immeasurably. That makes the rest of chapter 11 here, the rest of the life of Solomon, such a jarring contrast. So let's look and see what happened. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations of which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you. They will certainly turn your heart away to follow their gods. But Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses or women of rank, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. King Solomon loved many foreign women. The word order there in the Hebrew text emphasizes the word foreign, and there's a secondary emphasis on the adjective many. Solomon here had committed two very grave sins. Taking these foreign wives from these particular people who are named violated the Lord's prohibition against marrying Canaanite women. Taking this many wives violated the standard of monogamy that was established at the beginning in Genesis chapter 2. And it resulted in this overwhelming, this rampant polygamy here, which God had forbidden to Israel's kings in Deuteronomy 17:17. So, and we understand that many of Solomon's marriages were in accordance with the culture and the practices of that day, of sealing alliances by marriages between members of royal houses and making alliances that way. But this yielding to the culture of the day would have serious spiritual consequences for Solomon and his people. Verse 2 spells out the danger of marrying these pagan unbelievers. It's a quotation from Deuteronomy chapter 7, starting at verse 3, where it says, furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your sons away from following me. They will serve other gods, and then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you. But this is what you shall do to them. You shall tear down their altars, smash their memorial stones, cut their Asherim to pieces, and burn their carved images in the fire. For you are a holy people to the Lord. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his personal possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. The Lord did not make you his beloved, nor choose you because you were greater in number than any of the peoples, since you were the fewest of all peoples, but because the Lord loved you and kept the oath which he swore to your forefathers. The Lord brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God, he is God, the faithful God, who keeps his covenant and his faithfulness to 1,000 generations for those who love him and keep his commandments. But he repays those who hate him to their faces, to eliminate them. He will not hesitate toward those who hate him. He will repay him to his face. Therefore you shall keep the commandment, the statutes, and the judgments which I am commanding you today to do them. Be hard to be much plainer than what God was with Israel there as he spelled out the dangers. And what he said there is exactly what happened to Solomon. The Moabites and the Ammonites that he mentions in verse 1 were descendants of Abraham's nephew Lot. The Ammonites worshipped a very notorious god, Molech, who's well known for child sacrifice and part of that religious practice there. The Moabites, Chemosh was their chief god, and we'll see more about him in a little bit. Ashtoreth, or Astarte, was the goddess of the temple of the Sidonians there. The Edomites were the descendants of Esau, and they had become enemies of the Israelites. There's a long history of hostility between them. The Sidonians are linked to Sidon, the son of Canaan. The Hittites are often linked to Heth, another son of Canaan. And of course, Canaan was a son of Ham, grandson of Noah. And the Canaanites became a kind of a generic name for those different pagan groups who lived in and around the Promised Land. Solomon ignored God's repeated warning against mixing with these idolatrous nations. You have to wonder, how could this man who was granted such great wisdom from God and is described as loving the Lord, could go so completely astray? Did he trust his own wisdom rather than listening to the prophets of God? Was his wisdom limited to his role as king and judge and not his personal choices? The Quest Study Bible, in response to this kind of question, says Solomon's wisdom did not fail him. He failed to follow it. Having wisdom does not guarantee its use. By the end of his life, Solomon had broken most of the proverbs he himself had written. If wisdom is the application of knowledge, then obedience is the application of wisdom there. A preacher named Ed Vasicek several years ago asked that same question. He says in his reply, emotions were at war with wisdom. Emotions ruled over wisdom and enslaved him. The wise Solomon acted the fool. And he says, if you think about it, most of the sins we struggle with, we know they're wrong, and we know they have consequences. However you choose to interpret why it happened, it's clear that Solomon allowed his personal desires to cause him to reject God's clear commands, and that had tragic results. It's certainly ironic that Solomon would write in Proverbs 14:12, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Verse 3 tells us he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. It's been noted by many different commentators that polygamy was not part of God's plan for marriage, but the practice was very common in the ancient world. David had a number of wives, but Solomon took the practice to new extremes. He had 700 wives, and they're described as princesses or women of rank here, referring to their royal lineage. They were important politically and economically to Solomon and to the nation of Israel. The alliances that resulted from these marriages helped to ensure peace for Israel during Solomon's reign. The 300 concubines are harder for me to understand. In the Bible, a concubine was a woman acquired by a man as a secondary wife. Her purpose was to provide a male heir in the case of a barren wife, to provide more children in general, to enhance the family's workplace and wealth, and to satisfy the man's sexual desires. A concubine in the Hebrew life had certain rights and protections, but was not equal in status with a wife. So there's no obvious political or economic benefit to Solomon in having all of these concubines. As our lesson writer says, this reveals a disturbing flaw in Solomon's character. We have no way of knowing the depth of relationship he had with any of these women, even though in verse 2 it tells us that he clung to these women in love. Some have described the process as Solomon collecting these wives and concubines as trophies and symbols of power. Again, regardless of how you interpret this harem turned Solomon's heart away, just as God had warned. And we know that God understands our weakness and our frailty, but his warnings are given for our good and for our protection. And when we, like Solomon, ignore the commandments and statutes of God, we will face his judgment and the consequences of our sin. And we're certainly going to see that spelled out in graphic detail in the rest of our study today. Verses 4 through 8. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away to follow other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of his father had been. For Solomon became a follower of Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and of Milcom, the abhorrent idol of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he did not follow the Lord fully as his father David had done. And then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abhorrent idol of Moab, on the mountain that's east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abhorrent idol of the sons of Ammon. He also did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. In last week's lesson, at the end of chapter 8, in verse 61, Solomon had exhorted the people of Israel, to have hearts that were perfect with the Lord. The verse reads, "Your hearts therefore shall be wholly devoted to the Lord our God, to walk in his statutes and to keep his commandments as at this day." So his instruction here is for them to give undivided loyalty and be totally yielded to God alone. And yet, his own heart did not follow what he had instructed. He didn't totally abandon God, but he made him one of the many gods that he worshiped. Back in chapter 9 and verse 25, it tells us that 3 times a year Solomon offered burnt offerings and peace offerings on the altar which he had built for the Lord, burning incense with them on the altar which was before the Lord. So he finished the house. So he worshiped God, but he allowed these other things to creep in, which was a direct violation of the first 2 commandments that God gave at Sinai. The Lord is the only God, the true and living God, and he won't be put on the same level as the false idols of the nation. Isaiah 46:9 says, "For I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me." The last part of verse 4 says that Solomon was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of his father David had been. That's kind of interesting because we know David's history. So how could David be regarded as a man whose heart was totally and fully devoted to the Lord. Because we know David committed many sins, serious sins, some sins that were even punishable by death. But when confronted with his sin, David demonstrated true repentance. And additionally, David never turned from the living God to idols, as we see Solomon begin to do, and as many of the kings who followed him did. He clearly believed that there was no other God. His morality wavered, but his faith never did there. And I think there's a lesson for us there, because all of us make mistakes there. Our morality wavers, but our faith needs to be consistent, and our hearts repentant when we recognize our sin. Verse 5 tells us Solomon became a follower of Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and of Milcom, the abhorrent idol of the Ammonites. And as we kind of walk through this, Solomon's compromise wasn't an abrupt, sudden thing. He gradually descended into his idolatry. And we'll see that progressive drift away from God in the description of his activities. And we see mention here of two of these pagan gods here. Ashtoreth was the goddess of fertility and the consort of the Canaanite god Baal. She's also known as Ishtar and Astarte, so she's a well-known deity there. And of course, the other god that's mentioned there is Molech or Milcom, and you see his name, Molech, Milcom, Malek, Miliku there. The Ammonite deity here. He's associated with the child sacrifice that we mentioned a while ago, the horrific practices there. So verse 6 says that Solomon began to do what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord fully, as David, his father, had done. Verse 7 reminds us of the significance of the high places that we talked about in the last couple of weeks. In our first lesson 2 weeks ago, in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 3, we learned that Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he was sacrificing and burning incense on the high places. The typical high place included a pile of stones or a staircase on a high hill, and those sites were centers of pagan worship, and they became alternate locations for the improper worship of God. So he built this high place for Chemosh, and he's described as the detestable god of Moab. We have some descriptions of this god in extra-biblical sources. The Mesha stone, a 9th century inscription there that celebrates this god Chemosh's victory over Israel after a period of defeat and punishment here. And the inscription that goes along with it there describes the intense animosity between Israel and Moab here. So those are just three examples of gods and different peoples that Solomon kind of drifted into worship with. Verse 8 says he also did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Notice the progression here. First, he permitted his wives to worship their own gods, and then he tolerated their idolatry and even built shrines for them. And eventually he began to participate in pagan practices with his wives. So he's a man with divided and disobedient heart. And Double-minded people are unstable and dangerous. James 1:8 says, their loyalty is divided between God and the world, and they are unstable in everything they do. So as Solomon began to participate in this worship, that's a good description of him. Verses 9 through 13. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him regarding this thing, that he was not to follow other gods, but he did not comply with what the Lord had commanded. So the Lord said to Solomon, since you've done this, and you've not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will certainly tear the kingdom away from you and will give it to your servant. However, I will not do it in your days only for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it away from the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. It was Solomon who wrote in Proverbs 4:23, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it springs the issues of life. But in his old age, his own heart was far away from the Lord. Since the discovery of the circulation of blood by William Harvey in the 17th century, everybody knows that the center of physical human life is the heart. But what's true physically is also true morally and spiritually. We are to love God with all our hearts and receive his word into our hearts. Proverbs 7:1-3 says, my son, keep my words and treasure my commandments within you. Keep my commandments and live, and my teaching as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers. Write them on the tablet of your heart. If our heart's wrong toward God, our entire life will be wrong. No matter how successful we may appear to be to others, that's what we see here. God was angry with Solomon because his heart was wrong toward God. It was turned away from God. Solomon couldn't plead ignorance. Twice the Lord had appeared to him. We saw in chapter 3, verse 5, in Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said, ask what you wish me to give you. And then, as we just read a few minutes ago in 1 Kings 9, the first few verses there, after Solomon had finished building the temple, the Lord appeared to him a second time. And again, he reiterated, as for you, if you walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and honesty, acting in accordance with everything that I have commanded you, and if you keep my statutes and my ordinance, then I'll establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, just as I promised your father David. So Solomon certainly knew the terms of the covenant. He knew the terms of the covenant as described in Deuteronomy 28-30. He referred to them in his prayer when he dedicated the temple. And as we've just seen, God reminded him of his responsibility to keep these commandments. Solomon's sin is magnified by the fact that he had all of these special privileges that he had enjoyed. He had ample evidence of God's love and power. He had abundantly tasted God's love by being chosen contrary to custom and expectation to be David's successor. He had been given a special personal name, Jedediah, loved by the Lord. He had received all of these benefits from God. He had been visited by God twice personally. He had seen the power of God as he was put on the throne in the face of the challenge of Adonijah. And he was given success beyond anything he could ever have imagined. All of that should have created in Solomon a lifelong love and devotion to God. The second special privilege that Solomon had was his relationship to David and the covenant that God had made with David and had extended to Solomon here. He hadn't earned his position, he was born to it. And he had also been thoroughly instructed and trained by David, probably by Nathan as well, in preparation for this high calling that was his. Back in chapter 2, verse 2, as David's time to die drew near, he commanded his son Solomon, saying, I'm going the way of all the earth, so be strong and prove yourself a man. Do your duty to the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, his testimonies, according to what's written in the law of Moses, so that you may succeed in all that you do. And wherever you turn, so that the Lord may fulfill his promise which he spoke regarding me, saying, if your sons are careful about their way to walk before me in truth with all their heart, with all their soul, you shall not be deprived of a man to occupy the throne of Israel. So David had poured into Solomon his love and passion for the Lord, his dreams for the temple here, and Solomon threw all these aside when he followed after idols. He frittered away all that had been given to him. And the punishment fits the crime. Because God says to him in verse 11, since you have not kept my covenant, my statutes, I will tear the kingdom away from you and will give it to your servant. Now, even here, God exercised mercy for David's sake. The kingdom was not taken away from Solomon during his lifetime, and it wasn't totally removed from the lineage of David. God would keep the tribe of Judah for the descendants of David and would eventually fulfill all of his promises to David. As you read on in the rest of that chapter, verse 13 is the close of our focal passage today, but as you read on in the rest of chapter 11 here, Solomon's system now begins to deteriorate. The Lord raised up adversaries against him, and we see in verses 14 through 22, Hadad, the Edomite, another of these people who are hostile. And then there's Rezin of Damascus in verses 23 through 25. And then there's a homegrown adversary, one of Solomon's servants, starting in verse 26. Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite of Zeradah, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow, also rebelled against the king. Now this was the reason why he rebelled. Solomon built the Millo and closed up the breach of the city of his father David. And now the man Jeroboam was a valiant warrior. And when Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he appointed him over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph. And it came about at that time, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, that the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found him on the road. Now Ahijah had clothed himself with a new cloak, and both of them were alone in the field. Then Ahijah took hold of the new cloak which was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Behold, I am going to tear the kingdom away from the hand of Solomon and give you 10 tribes. But he shall have one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel. because they have abandoned me and have worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, Milcom, the god of the sons of Ammon, and they've not walked in my ways, doing what's right in my sight, and keeping my statutes and my ordinances, as his father David did. Nevertheless, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose, who kept my commandments, my statutes. But I'll take the kingdom from his son's hand and give it to you, that is, 10 tribes. But to his son I'll give 1 tribe, so that my servant David may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I have chosen for myself to put my name. However, I will take you, Jeroboam, and you shall reign over all that you desire, and you shall be king over Israel. And then it shall be that if you listen to all that I command you and walk in my ways, do what's right in my sight by keeping my statute and my commandments, as my servant David did, then I'll be with you and build you an enduring house as I built for David, and I'll give Israel to you. Solomon sought therefore to put Jeroboam to death, but Jeroboam set out and fled to Egypt, and he was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. So here we're introduced to Jeroboam, and as we continue our study, Jeroboam will be important. What do we take from this? Many believe that Solomon wrote the book of Ecclesiastes late in his life. His words in the last chapter of that book are a good summation. Ecclesiastes 12. First verse says, "Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come, and years approach when you will say, I have no pleasure in them." And then jumping down to verse 13. The conclusion, when everything has been heard, is fear God. Keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it's good or evil. The conclusion, when everything's been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments. Certainly, Solomon did not follow that, and we need to heed the warning that he leaves us there. Thank you.